welcome to this videocast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Well, it's been a week, again, of much ludicrousness, not least having watched some of the debate in Parliament over the British bombing in Syria. But perhaps the depths of ludicrousness were plumbed by Prince Charles and the British singer Charlotte Church, who blamed the crisis in Syria on global warming. Is there anything that happens that isn't caused by global warming that actually isn't happening? Well, it's a nice day today, isn't it? Global warming. Ooh, gee, a bit chilly, isn't it? Global warming. On and on it goes. So why is there this obsession with selling us this blatant lie about the planet being in mortal danger from something that's not happening? There is an answer to that, which I'm going to go into today. And funnily enough, I am going to connect the crisis and the wars in Syria and the Middle East to global warming, or climate change as it's become since temperatures stopped going up. But clearly I'm not going to connect them in the way that Prince Charles and Charlotte Church did. But they are connected in this way. I talked in the videocast last week about how the sequence of wars and regime changes and conquests were part of a vast global agenda to create a centralized tyranny based on a world government, world army, world central bank, world currency, cashless, and microchipped population, etc. But you don't just bring that about through war. There is this great spectrum of reasons and excuses that are being played out to justify the creation of that tyranny, that centralized global tyranny where the population are kept under fierce control through a merciless, vicious police state, which we're seeing unfold all the time, globally, of course. And one of these excuses is global warming. The reason it doesn't stack up when you look at the evidence rather than the propaganda is because it's a lie. The same reason that the excuses that I exposed last week for going into Iraq and Libya and Syria are lies, because they are manufactured excuses to create an outcome, which is advancing this what I call totalitarian tiptoe. Indeed, it's a bloody sprint now to this centralized tyranny. And what's kind of frustrating sometimes, well, perhaps even more than sometimes, is when you see people who are focused on one thing, like stopping British bombing in Syria, for instance, and for very good reason. And yet they are caught in another part of this excuse spectrum to create this global tyranny, which, of course, they wouldn't want. And until people get informed about the nature of this world transformation that's going on, and the excuses being used to impose it, and the techniques of perception manipulation to get us to see the world in ways that will allow this tyranny to unfold. Unless people have a grasp of that, then they're going to go on going against it here, but supporting it here. So, for instance, we have people who will oppose the bombing in Syria, but also go out on the street demanding action over climate change to save the planet. And yet those two things, one they oppose, one they support, are two masks on the same face. And one of the things we need to get over is this obsession with the United Nations and the fact that it's some benevolent organization trying to bring peace and harmony to the planet. I've been exposing the background to the United Nations and the League of Nations that went before it in my books for decades. It's not been created to bring peace and harmony. It's been created as a stalking horse for world government, a stepping stone to world government. And as more and more power is given to the United Nations, that you can see those stepping stones unfolding. The United Nations is quoted constantly. Well, the United Nations says this, we must do it. I watched the debate in Parliament this week over the bombing in Syria. And we had people quoting the United Nations. We must support the United Nations. The United Nations has said this and it's given us the and all this stuff. The United Nations was created by the same hidden hand that is behind these multiple wars. It was manipulated into place by organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, which is part of a network of secret and semi-secret organizations, which now include the Bilderberg Group and others, the Trilateral Commission. And that network is controlled by the Rothschild and Rockefeller families, among others. The Rockefellers were right at the center of the creation of the United Nations. Indeed, the very building is standing on land donated by the Rockefeller family. Now, do a tiny smear of research into the history of the Rockefeller family, and then explain to me how they could possibly have any interest whatsoever in peace, harmony, fairness, justice, and equality. But they were behind the United Nations. Now, what organization is behind the global warming scam? The United Nations and its Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is headed, by the way, by a railway engineer who would do the world a lot more good going and mending some track or some wagons or something, instead of spouting the nonsense that has created this hysteria. But there's something else. And this is where the connections start. In 1992, at the big environment conference in Rio de Janeiro, something began called Agenda 21. This has now been updated and agreed by multiple global nations, just like they're trying to do in Paris currently over global warming. It's been updated to be called Agenda 2030. Who runs Agenda 21, Agenda 2030? The United Nations. And what are they? They are a plan for the centralized control globally of everything. All resources, all of society centrally controlled. Do you know what the main excuse for introducing Agenda 21, Agenda 2030 is, and create this centralized control? The threat to the planet of global warming. That ain't happening. So when people say to me, well, if they're lying about this human-caused climate change, and of course there's always bloody climate change, human-caused climate change, then what would be the point? Why is it happening? It's happening because these agendas, 21, 2030, same thing, different name, are absolutely dependent for their success on changes being made to centralize everything to save the planet from global warming. So they're fundamentally connected and they're all being channeled through the same source, the United Nations. Now, is everybody lying? No, of course not. Most people that say, oh, we've got to save the planet, are actually believing the lie. And so you have a situation, for instance, where Jeremy Corbyn will speak against bombing in Syria, quite right, but then he'll support action to meet the challenge, here it says here, of global warming, which is part of the same global agenda of which bombing in Syria is part. And lest we forget, carbon dioxide is the gas of life. Without carbon dioxide, we'd all be dead. Let's demonize a gas of life, shall we? Without the greenhouse effect, which holds heat in and stops it escaping, we would all be ice lollies. Kaput! Let's demonize a process that is essential to life. And by the way, talking about the greenhouse effect, this is a graph of greenhouse gases. Guess which one is CO2? It's got to be that one, isn't it? It's got to be this one. That's CO2. Oh, look, it's dangerous, isn't it? That, right up in the 90% of greenhouse gases, is water vapor. Clouds and such like. I know. Let's demonize condensation. Let's ban it. This here, lift it up a bit. This one here is CO2. And the vast majority of that is naturally created, not created by humans. The scale of the lie is extraordinary, and it is justifying a transformation of global society into this tyranny that lies at the end of it. If you notice also that these characters that go on about, oh, CO2, it's global warming, it's going to destroy the planet. Have you noticed they never mention the sun in terms of heating? I feel it in me water that the sun has an impact on Earth temperature. I just feel it instinctively. You know, I mean, when the sun comes out, you know, it kind of gets warm. So you get the feel that it's got something to do with heat. But they never talk about the sun. And yet, when you look at the graphs of sun activity, in other words, the cycles of power coming from the sun and Earth temperature, they go up together and down together. There was a group of scientists at CERN, this global center of physics, who produced a graph showing the almost exact correlation between the penetration of cosmic rays into the Earth's atmosphere and Earth temperature. And that, until it kind of leaked out that was being suppressed, that was not allowed to go into the public arena because it showed the lie to be exactly that, a lie. And ironically, Jeremy Corbyn's brother is Piers Corbyn, a bit of a, what you might call, renegade weatherman. In other words, he doesn't buy the lie, who is a staunch opponent of the global warming nonsense. And what does he put the changes in Earth temperature down to, among other things? The sun. Got to be mad, isn't he? How can he say that? It's ridiculous. So you have this situation where people go and protest against austerity, they protest against the big brother state, they protest against bombing in Syria, all of which, you know, round of applause, I say. But then, because they're not seeing the big picture in which it all works, I mean, my last book, The Perception Deception, was 500,000 words. There is a big, big picture. But if you don't see the big picture, then it will get you somehow. It will pull you in. And so the people protesting against those things, but then they'll go and protest and demand that action be taken against the threat of global warming because they bought the lie. And what's planned is everything they're protesting about elsewhere. And of course, you know, the Greens, the Green parties, they're not going to come out and say, actually, we've been mistaken all these years. It's a scam. And they've got vested interests in global warming being accepted because that gives more credibility to their green politics. And then you look at the scientists, and people say, well, there's all these scientists. Yes, and there's a lot of other scientists, a lot and gathering number of other scientists who are actually saying it's all a load of nonsense. I'll get into them later in the videocast. But these scientists that come out and say it's all true, let's not forget that a study of money spent on saving us from global warming estimated that globally $1.5 trillion is being spent every year on this whole climate change caused by humans nonsense. And so the gravy train of those that say, yeah, it's true, is absolutely enormous. And there's another thing. Why is it that the same people who are telling us that greenhouse gases are threatening the future of the world, those same authorities are supporting fracking, which releases greenhouse gases. Those same authorities are suppressing free energy technology, which people like Nikola Tesla in the first part of the 20th century proved to be a fact. Free energy technology that accesses the natural electrical, electromagnetic energy fields in the atmosphere all around us and turns it into usable warmth and power without use of fossil fuel. Why are the same people going on about global warming and the dangers of it suppressing that, as they have been since Tesla was alive? And another thing, people who are telling the truth do not fix the data, because if they're telling the truth, they don't have to. But that is what has been exposed again and again. Scientists fixing the data. Do you remember that scary graph called the hockey stick, where they produced these temperatures where it went along, and then suddenly, just at the time they wanted us to believe, it shot up? Complete lie. Been exposed as such, because what they did was ignore something called the medieval warm period. This was about 1,000 years ago, when temperatures were hotter than they are now. Now, what caused it then? Turbocharged handcarts. So the graph would have been like that. Much different. So they just ignored it, got rid of it. All complete manipulation. And then, after the medieval warm period, from about 1350 to about 1800, we went into something called the Little Ice Age. And during the Little Ice Age, when they had ice fairs on the Thames, because it was so frozen over, we also had something called the Maunder Minimum. This was the minimum of sunspot activity of the sun, which correlated very, very low sun activity with plummeting temperatures. And so, as we were coming out of the Little Ice Age, that's when they started the records and data for climate information and temperature. So when they say it's the hottest day since records began, well, first of all, how are you measuring that? And secondly, the records began as we were still coming out of the Little Ice Age. So the connection is totally false because of that. And Earth temperatures, as measured by satellite, etc., have not risen since 1997-98. So, some facts, not propaganda. The ice at the poles is not receding. In fact, it's been growing recently. Polar bears are not disappearing. Their numbers have been growing. The Maldives Islands, etc., are not disappearing under the sea. Experts in sea levels, one of whom has written 600 papers on the subject, come to him later, has said that in 40 years he has observed no rising of sea levels around the Maldives. And yet you have the Maldives government having a meeting underwater to highlight the fact that they're in danger. It's a monumental scam to create fear, to create guilt. What about the children? To frighten the shit out of the children, to impose a global tyranny fundamentally connected to what's happening currently in the Middle East. And when people see the big picture and all its elements, then we can see the lie. But until then, people will go on protesting against this part of the agenda and calling for that part to be introduced.